3. "Up!" Jake yelled as giant birds came in for the attack. He threw the lever to maximum. The silver balloon lurched toward the sky as the nozzle belched aggro into the small flame and turned it into a swirling inferno. The airship began to rise, but not fast enough to avoid the giant black birds of prey bearing down on them from the wide side of the pass. "Maz, turn the props toward the sky!" The pilot pulled a finger-thick cotter pin out of the wall next to the steering wheel. The wing on the starboard side of the ship suddenly twisted 90 degrees and began to lift them faster. Maz jammed the pin back in to lock the new position. With one propeller pushing up and the other still forward, the whole craft began to spin. Rushing to the port side, the pilot pulled the second pin. Now the ship was gaining altitude, but not fast enough to escape their attackers. If they could crest the tall cliffs, they would be safe. The huge birds would never follow them up there. Jake eased up on the lever. More heat wouldn't make any difference now. If they were going to live through this, they would need that fuel for the guns. One of the 3 black eagles bearing down on them screeched a war cry, which echoed along the length of the long tunnel. As the aquiline giants neared, Jake saw small gray dots on their backs. Riders. 3 giant predators would never attack a balloon in formation otherwise. The ship was equipped to deter one cliff-dwelling bird. With native riders, however, they were far more dangerous than natural hunters were. Any one of those bird beaks would be enough to tear the metallic skin of the balloon and bring them down. "We're not gonna make it," Jake cursed. He straightened his dingy brown jacket and tested the swivel and tilt of the hollow metal rod sticking out the front of the elongated gondola. He pushed a button to spark the pilot light on the end. "Ready on the scorchers!" "Ready," Jen called cheerfully from the top. She always loved a good air fight. "Ready," Maz said from the aft mount. He still had one hand on the wheel and sounded bored. He mostly wore brown to match his eyes, currently covered by tinted goggles. It resembled the military uniform from his days he never discussed. Jake figured their odds. 3 crew members with 3 guns against 3 alien attackers on 3 warbirds. They were in big trouble. The oblong balloon continued to spin and rise as the black birds wove a wicked braid through the air. With all the motion, it would be hard to line up a shot on any one of them. The pattern took the birds close to the cliffs on either side where the avian war mounts nimbly slalomed trees and parapets. Jake faced the attackers when the first metal razor darts began zipping the air and cutting tiny holes in the bag above him. He knew they were still too far out, but he pulled the trigger anyway. A blob of flaming goo sprayed out of the nozzle. Bullets were too heavy for an airship. When they couldn't avoid a fight, they used fuel as their weapon. The small burst of flame pitched out and arced, unnaturally lighting the rocks and vegetation on both sides. It slowed and fell before it reached the birds. It was like trying to hunt wild game with a tube of toothpaste. Not only did the aliens have speed and agility on their side, they had range. More darts zipped in and more air hissed out of the tiny holes. Jake wasn't concerned yet. The bag had a sticky tar on the inside that would plug small holes. Maz added a little heat to draft more air into the balloon. As the spinning ship rose, the birds split up like wingmen at an air show. One went high, another low, the last swiveling forward on course to ram the bag. Jen and Maz both started spitting tiny jets of fuel across the midline. If the rider was on a suicide mission, he might try to fly through the fire and crash into the almost fireproof bag. Luckily, the metallized fabric and tar of the bag were almost fireproof. The warbird instinctively feared fire, so it twisted away. Now that it was close, Jake could see the thin gray spider on the bird's back. He was humanoid, except he had 8 long, thin appendages, allowing him to hold on to the bird with plenty of arms left to work the dart guns and flail a sword around menacingly. Skinny and light, the spiders were a graceful, barbaric species. As it retreated, the spider pointed 3 arms toward the bag and shot another dozen holes into it from pistol-sized dart guns. The 4th free arm pointed at Maz. The old veteran ducked as thin metal blades thunked into the hole next to his gun. As the propeller struggled to help lift the giant balloon, Jake kept his eyes on the eagle that had gone below them. The cliffs on each side were unbelievably deep. The sunlight from the opening failed to illuminate all the way to the bottom of the massive gorge. Jake knew the darkness shrouded an abyss of water. Compared to what was in the deep, spiders and warbirds were neighbors delivering welcome cookies. Jake watched as the bird dove into the dark and disappeared. Jen yelled taunts and spurted fuel at the attackers above them from the crow's nest. Even though the balloon blocked his view of the action, burning trails fell like an umbrella of slow-motion fireworks on every side. 2 of the birds circled above, swooping down in turns. The gun mount wouldn't shoot straight up, because that would just bring the flaming pitch right back down on the ship, so she had to work at angles. They didn't have enough fuel for her to keep that up long. Her gleeful shout suggested she loved every minute of it, while the ammo lasted. Jake looked over at Maz, who continued searching the dark trench below for any sign of the 3rd eagle. When Maz looked up and shrugged, Jake shook his head. "We aren't gonna make it." Maz pointed up. "This is supposed to be an easy run. We need more lift. Dump the cargo? Jake sighed and bit his lip. Only the food, not the spices. If Jen keeps pumping out fuel like that, we should get plenty of light. Jake shook his head. How long had they had a full tank and new food reserves? An hour, maybe? They rushed to the cargo hold, the only level below the deck. Maz jumped down and started throwing 10-pound boxes up through the trapdoor. Jake tossed them over the side just as fast. He lobbed them in random directions, hoping to beat the odds and hit the bird down there with one of them. When he heard a war cry scream up from below, he knew the boxes hadn't found their mark. He let the next box land on the deck as he grabbed the aft gun and started blasting down into the deep. Heedless, the black warbird streaked past them like a bullet. Reaching out with giant claws, it reversed and latched onto the side of the balloon. 8 talons pierced the bag. Air whistled out of the holes too big for the tar to reseal. Jake swiveled the gun toward the bird, but the safety restraints preventing it from pointing at the balloon stopped it short of the target. The fire shot went wide. He yanked out a pistol and fired. Like shooting a cow, only hitting a vital organ would really hurt it. The pain made the bird lurch and leap away from the balloon, pulling a 6-inch gash in the side of the bag. The bird rocketed up to join the other 2 harrying Jen. Jake felt weightlessness turn his stomach as the rise of the balloon ended. The air escaping the balloon snapped the loose bag fabric like thunder. Maz jumped out of the hold and leaned over the side to see the offending wound. "We can fix it." "Jen!" Jake screamed. "Take it easy! We got a gusher! We need to save some fuel!" She called back. "They're too fast! I can't give them a break!" Maz pulled out a wide plastic tube shaped like a short, fat bazooka. Then he hooked a carabiner from his belt onto the rail of the ship's gondola. While the pilot balanced on the gondola's rail, Jake grabbed his crewman's ankles to help steady him against the thunderous wind. Maz leaned way back, so he stood sideways with one of the ship's propeller wings chopping at the air dangerously close to his head. Taking careful aim with the cannon, he fired one blast at the side of the balloon. Jake had to pull Maz's legs to keep the kick of the blast from pushing him off the side of the airship. The white gunk stuck to the bag. A bubble formed where the air had been rushing out of the hole. The glue quickly dried hard, sealing the hole before it popped. It looked like their beautiful ship had a pus-filled boil. The patch held. It was covering half the ship's name. Instead of Sky Turtle, it just said Skirtle. Maz tossed the useless tube into the abyss, and Jake pulled him back onto the deck. Jake cranked the throttle, sending another vortex of fire up into the balloon. The ship lurched again and began to rise faster. As blobs of fire rained down on every side of them, Jake knew the tank was almost empty. The speed of the balloon's ascent testified that fuel didn't weigh them down. Suddenly, Jen stopped shooting. Jake checked the cliffs. Near the hard black cap of rock at the top, the plants reached 20 feet away from the cliff, leaving just enough room for their fat ship to go through without bushwhacking. These were ancient, dense trees, thicker and more gnarled than the umbrella trees below. They greedily sucked up every bit of sunlight they could reach. In thinner trenches, they completely covered the opening. Above them lay a thick layer of metamorphic rock that covered the whole surface of Schism. Nothing could grow on it, though the vines tried. If the upper crust of rock rose another 40 feet, why did the birds leave so soon? "Incoming!" Maz yelled. It was the first time he had expressed any emotion today. Jake swiveled his gun. The safety lock stopped him again. Maz was already squirting flames down on his side. Jake kicked the metal safety lock with his heavy boot, and the small piece flitted down into the chasm below. Then he turned the gun around so he was firing across the deck. He let 2 jets go before Maz looked at him with wild fear in his eyes and yelled, "Watch the ropes, or Jen will be the only one that gets out of this trench!" This time, the birds were spiraling in together, twisting close like a drill. Maz risked a long circular twist of fire, spraying out a cone from his flamethrower. The birds panicked. Against the will of their spider riders, they bolted in 3 different directions. The last spider turned and threw 3 hands in their direction, but no darts came. Instead, a blue light reflected off all the nearby leaves as a ray of light landed on their balloon. Then the ground dropped away. Out in the open air, the Sky Turtle was in full view of the burning sun of Schism. The crew turned away from the bright orb and snapped dark lenses over their goggles. Maz kept his back to the new furnace as he pulled the pins and cranked the levers that would turn the props so the ship would go forward instead of up. Jen rappelled down the side of the balloon and swung onto the deck, tying off the rope they used to get to the crow's nest. "There's something on the side of the balloon," she said as Jake checked the fuel gauge. The red pin indicated empty. He cranked the burner down to minimum, and the balloon continued to rise as it floated across the great flat surface of Schism. Black rock, burned to a crisp long ago, stretched as far as the eye could see. In a dozen distant places, large columns of smoke rose into the air, bending with the same wind pushing them. The closest vent caught Jake's eye. "What's that?" Jake asked as he pulled out a telescope and estimated how far they were from the next trench. He saw a few steam-powered skimmers far off on the horizon. Those were humans. Spiders never came up on the surface. The cliff-walled chasms were the only inhabitable places on Schism. Jake scanned the barren land for the nearest crack that would get them out of the brutal sun. They were heading the wrong direction to sell their cargo. Jake made a mental map, trying to remember if he could be lucky enough to be on good terms with the owner of the nearest downwind vent. Maz turned to the airship as soon as Jake pointed. It was going to be close.
"That spider left a present on the bag,"
Jen said. When she pointed up the way she'd come, her tied sleeve fell to her shoulder, revealing a butterfly tattoo. The patterns on the wings made the whole thing look like a witch's face.
"It looks like a thin skull with wavy lines coming out. Biggest glyph I've ever seen, glowing on the side of our boat."
"They cursed us?" Jake said, gritting his teeth. "That wasn't marked territory. They had no reason to attack."
"Except for the fact that they hate all humans."
Jen smiled. She had one gloved hand up to further shade her dark goggles, scanning the black horizon away from the sun. Schism moved in a geosynchronous orbit. The relentless sun bombarded the bright side, making it too hot for anything organic to survive. All water there evaporated. The shadow on the dark side sapped it of any heat. All the water froze there. In a wide band around the middle, the border between the two extremes, it was just temperate enough to live. But only in the trenches. The dark bottom of every trench held a deep abyss of water. The humidity rose from it and condensed on the trees above. Then it ran down the sides, feeding the plants and animals that clung to the habitable walls. Each trench was like a tiny atrium with a temperate section that became an oven in one direction and a freezer in the other. Maz tapped the altimeter with a puzzled look. "Wonderful." Jake spat over the side of the rail. "Why are we losing altitude?" "Makes no sense," Maz said, confirming the patch on the side still held.
"It's the curse."
Jen frowned.
"The bag's cursed."
"No way," Jake pointed at her. "After all it's been through, the sky turtle is not going down because of some stupid spider magic."
"Can't we just tip the props again?"
Jen asked. "The propellers can't hold up the whole ship," Maz said. "They're just for thrust." Jake eased the lever to increase the burn. The flame roared up for a moment, and then sputtered. A single pop heralded the end of their aggro. The ship continued to descend as it drifted. With the fuel gone, the propellers slowly wound down. Halfway between two habitable trenches, a favorable wind kept them drifting.
"We'll never survive hiking across the surface,"
Jen said. "If we land, we can roll the gondola to protect us from the sun and try to signal some of those steam skimmers for help," Maz suggested. "I'm not leaving my boat." Jake ran to the edge and looked at the bag with the large blue glyph glowing on the side. There was no physical reason for the descent. "We just need more lift," he said. He paced to the front of the ship.